Early in 1945, our B-29s began full-scale operations against Japan. 1,500 miles to targets and 1,500 miles back from bases at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam.
Hi, I'm Paul Carter. Thank you for joining me from Thailand. The story I will tell you today is of the U.S. Army Air Force incendiary bombing campaign against Japan during the final 6 months of World War II. What the campaign was, why it was undertaken, its purpose, why it was flown at low altitude and mainly at night, how it was executed, and the results. 100% of the film and almost all the photographs are original. As the Japanese fighter threat diminished the last few months of the war, when the B-29 bombers finished their bombing runs over Japan and turned south towards the Marianas, the U.S. B-51 fighter escorts stayed on station and began strafing missions. This video is longer than most of my videos because I have populated it with amazing aerial and other combat footage and audio to help tell the story. It was during this period the Americans built and deployed a next-generation bomber that allowed this feat, the B-29 Superfortress.
This is the B-29. It's the biggest, fastest, mightiest heavy bomber in the world. It can travel farther and higher than anything else on wings. It has a pressurized cabin, permitting high-altitude flight without oxygen masks. It has 5 remotely controlled, electrically driven turrets, each carrying twin 50s, with a 20-millimeter cannon added to the turret in the tail. Bombardier, who sits directly ahead of the pilot and co-pilot. Navigator, who is some distance behind the pilot, facing forward. Flight engineer, who is directly behind the co-pilot, facing aft. Radio operator, who sits across from the navigator and faces the right wall. Gun commander, who is in the top of the fuselage amidships and can face in any direction. Left gunner, who faces aft. Right gunner, who also faces aft. And the tail gunner, who stays close to the putt-putt during takeoff and landing. His combat position, of course, is in the tail. That turret you see moving is only one of the 5 on the ship, which mounts a total of 10 machine guns and 1 cannon. 4 of the turrets, 2 on top and 2 beneath the fuselage, can turn through 360 degrees in azimuth, 90 degrees in elevation. The tail turret is more restricted in movement, but it has a 20-millimeter cannon in addition to the twin 50s the others carry. But the big thing about the 29's armament is the fact that the gunners don't touch the guns. The guns are controlled remotely from special sites, and any gunner can fire almost any turret. For example, one side gunner might have control of 2 turrets, firing 4 caliber 50s at his target.
In the first effective raid in this campaign, on a single night, March 9, 1945, the U.S. Army Air Force burned to death 100,000 Tokyo men, women, and children and left 1 million homeless. This 100,000 number is probably low, claims researcher Mark Seldon, considering the inferno consumed a geographic area of almost 16 square miles containing an estimated 1.5 million people. By July 1945, the U.S. had destroyed by incendiary bombing all but 5 Japanese cities. The destruction was remarkable, ranging from 50 to 60% of the urban area destroyed in cities including Kobe, Yokohama, and Tokyo, to 60 to 88% in 17 cities, to 98.6% of Toyama. In Tokyo that night, nature had reinforced man's handiwork in the form of Akakaze, the red wind that swept with hurricane force across the Tokyo plain and propelled firestorms across the city with terrifying speed and intensity. The wind drove temperatures up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, creating superheated vapors that advanced ahead of the flames, killing or incapacitating their victims. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which had only been created months earlier, concluded probably more persons lost their lives by fire at Tokyo in a 6-hour period than at any time in the history of man. People died from extreme heat, from oxygen deficiency, from carbon monoxide asphyxiation, from being trampled beneath the feet of stampeding crowds, and from drowning. The largest number of victims were the most vulnerable: women, children, and the elderly. U.S. forces were always fighting towards the Marianas, the closest set of islands to the Japanese mainland, to get close enough to conduct the bombing. By occupying these islands, about 1,500 miles from the Japanese homeland, the B-29, with about a 5,500-mile range depending upon its load, could most effectively bomb Japan. The primary objective of this bombing campaign, where the U.S. threw the full force of its air power against a weakened but still deadly Japan, was to set the conditions for a U.S. troop invasion of the mainland in late 1945. Remember, the U.S. completely expected a land invasion would be required, just like required to defeat Germany. Before I forget, I have quite an interesting story about how and why this movie about the air campaign called The Last Bomb was made, and I'll share it towards the end. But first, let's begin by looking at two U.S. War Department maps to set the stage for this. The first shows Japanese expansion, the second Japanese implosion. The first serrated line is the intended Japanese expansion in the short term. They never got there. This red line shows their perimeter, their farthest advance, which was July 1942. This blue line shows the Japanese perimeter in November 1941. These smaller serrated blue lines show Japanese expansion prior to the war, many in the 1800s. And finally, this line represents Japan's perimeter in both 1868 and after their World War II surrender. The second map shows the U.S. conquest and Japanese implosion. This red line represents the farthest Japanese perimeter that I showed you earlier. This arrow represents the U.S. advance in seizing islands and moving towards Japan, beginning with the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. This red line represents the Japanese perimeter in March 1944. This red line represents the Japanese perimeter in August 1945, the month the emperor announced surrender. You can see the Japanese still occupied parts of China and Southeast Asia. The Potsdam Conference Declaration in 1943 established unconditional surrender as the terms for Japan. This new Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the U.S.'s technological solution to this difficult strategic problem of achieving unconditional surrender with a minimum of U.S. casualties. To illustrate the importance of air power in this fight, Army Air Force General Henry Hap Arnold, who was a Joint Chiefs of Staff Service Chief, foresaw the B-29 as the one weapon that could exert pressure against Japan. He had been given command of a newly created unit in early 1944, the 20th U.S. Army Air Force. Incredibly, the 20th Air Force was subordinate to the JCS, so Arnold didn't answer to Pacific Theater or area commanders, but instead was co-equal with the other service chiefs. Underneath the 20th, Arnold created the 20th and 21st Bomber Commands. The 21st was to be the primary command to bomb Japan. This increased pressure on Arnold to make the B-29 bombing of Japan work, not just for mission purposes and to soften Japan for the armed forces invasion, but for service reasons. You see, the Army and Navy was pining to get control of the B-29s. Even France asked for several. To keep them, Hap would have to show results. The first B-29 use against Japan was from China, also attacking Japanese units in Burma, Singapore, Thailand, and other targets. In late 1943, early 1944, the U.S. Army Air Force began building airfields in Chengdu, China. U.S. Army General and later Ambassador Henry Byrode was at this time a young Army engineering officer and was sent to China to oversee the construction of the airstrips. He says in a verbal interview, quote, "The Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, drafted the workforce, coolies. They would arrive there in groups, walking as far as 100 miles away, all organized in groups with their own cook, etc. We had 496,000 Chinese laborers on that job. We located the big fields along rivers as a source of rock, and they would carry the rock on their shoulders and heads up to 7 miles in each direction, break the rock by hand. We had no concrete, no cement in China. We had no asphalt. We had to build these runways for the biggest planes any of us had ever seen. The runways were 24 inches thick with crushed rock, and then clay and sand on top. It was almost unbelievable what was accomplished. 90 days after we started that project, the first B-29 came in. If we had had all the equipment America ever invented, I don't think we could have done it that fast. While I was originally an aviation engineer, we had designed all kinds of airborne engineering equipment. Little bulldozers, little rollers, everything that could be airborne. We were making the rollers, as an example, out of concrete. 5-ton rollers took 500 people to pull. 10-ton rollers, for some other reason, we pulled with 750 people. But as the B-29s came in, they brought little dollies to pull their airplanes around, and one of my young lieutenants got enthusiastic, and he used one of these to pull a roller all night. The next day, the Chinese wouldn't pull the big rollers. So, no more of that. We finally finished the fields, and General Kurt LeMay came in to command the bombing raids on Tokyo. He was extremely disappointed with the airfields, and I couldn't blame him because they were dusty. Kurt LeMay had been running 100 bomber missions over Europe, and of course he wanted to run that kind of mission over Tokyo. But the dust was so bad they couldn't take off that fast, and we had to fly in all the gasoline, so the planes couldn't circle overhead waiting for all of them to get off the ground and into formation. So, in utter disgust, he decided he had to fly single mission B-29s over Tokyo, one plane at a time, a minute or two in between takeoffs. It, of course, gave a psychological boost for our troops everywhere around the world. We were hitting Tokyo, and we did some damage, but not a great deal because the payload was not very great." End quote. Bombing attacks from Chengdu upon Japan began in August 1944, and even though LeMay's results were mixed, General Hap Arnold was noticing that LeMay was getting some results under austere circumstances, particularly in a December 18, 1944 raid where LeMay tried a new tactic. LeMay sent a fleet of B-29s against the Japanese at Hankow, China, but this time the B-29s flew much lower and carried incendiary versus high explosive bombs. The attack was devastatingly effective against the Japanese. LeMay now seemed to have a new tactic he could use, but to effectively bomb Japan, U.S. forces would need to be closer to the Japanese mainland, and the Marianas were the answer. The fight to capture the Marianas was bloody. The Marines especially paid a heavy price. You see, the Japanese understood the dangers of American B-29s operating from the Marianas. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, who commanded the Japanese defenders of Saipan, wrote regarding the defense of the Marianas, "The fate of the empire will be decided in this one action." Japanese stiff resistance in the Marianas and later at Iwo Jima was almost certainly due in part to this realization. The lieutenant general, wounded by shrapnel, committed ritual suicide in a cave at dawn on 10 July 1944, with his adjutant shooting him in the head after he had disemboweled himself. He was given a funeral with military honors by his American counterpart, U.S. Marine General Holland Smith. On June 24, 1944, even before the fighting had ceased in the Marianas, the first B-29 airfield was under construction. On 12 October 1944, General Haywood Hansell, commander of the 21st, landed the first B-29 on Saipan. Hansell, just like LeMay, was a veteran of daylight precision bombing over France in 1942 with B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers. By November, the 21st Bomber Command was ready for its first attack. The attacks were designed to dismantle the Japanese military, economic, and industrial systems and undermine the morale of the Japanese people to break their will to fight. Military theorists have written since literature on war began that there is only one way to win war, and that is to break the enemy's will to fight. When you don't, as evidenced in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the results are either a friendly force pullout or defeat. The first priority for attack was against the Japanese aircraft industry with precision bombing. Second was urban industrial areas that supported the war industry because this industry was meshed within the suburban areas. The third was an aerial mining campaign against Japanese shipping. On 23 November, Hansel commenced the first attack. Nakajima Aircraft Plant to the northwest of Tokyo. The attack was unsuccessful, 2 planes were lost, and the pilots found themselves in a stunning 140 mile per hour tailwind that pushed their planes to 445 miles per hour over the ground, much too fast for accurate bombing. In fact, the first 7 bombing attempts against this plant over several months were failures. Overall, the next 22 bombing missions through March on Japan were largely ineffective. Weather was the most significant problem for the operation. At bombing altitude of 30,000 feet, winds from 100 to 180 miles per hour were encountered. Winds were so strong it broke up airplane formations and rendered bombing inaccuracies, blowing hundreds of bombs harmlessly into the sea. Cloud cover was a significant problem at that altitude. Fuel consumption also increased at this altitude, and stress on the B-29 engine, which increased the incidence of engine fires. Bomb loads decreased at this altitude. When the 21st Bomber Command failed to deliver the destructive potential inherent in the B-29, General Arnold removed Hansel on 20 January 1945 and replaced him with General Curtis LeMay, who was commanding the 20th Bomber Command in China and had been achieving results against Japanese targets. LeMay knew changes were required in bombing procedures because of the weather at altitude was rendering bombing ineffective, and the U.S. had no weather intelligence. LeMay, now in command of the 21st, made radical changes. He lowered the bombing altitude between 5 and 10,000 feet because of weaker winds, fewer clouds, less engine strain, required less fuel, and he could put more bomb loads at these lower altitudes. In previous raids, many B-29s crashed in the sea on their way home because they had run out of fuel needed to get the crews back to the Marianas. Lower altitude meant greater accuracy, but more exposure to flak and enemy aircraft. Therefore, attacks would be at night for better defense, although not all were, particularly as Japan depleted its fighter aircraft force. Formation flying didn't work well at night, so planes would fly alone. Worried about friendly fire and to reduce fuel consumption and increase the bomb load, LeMay ordered the offloading of guns, ammunition, and gunners. These new tactics were so radical that most crews thought they might die on the mission. Finally, most of the munitions would be incendiary, not high explosive.
The main component of the M69 bomb, a cheesecloth sock containing specially processed jellied gasoline. When ignited, the gel filling becomes a clinging fiery mass spreading more than a yard in diameter. It burns at approximately 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 to 10 minutes. The bomb was developed by the National Defense Research Council in collaboration with the Chemical Warfare Service. In a demonstration, it is fired electrically from the ground against a wall. For airdrops, the M69 is assembled in groups of 38. The E-23 adapter is used in forming 500-pound aimable clusters carried by planes equipped to handle this size bomb. On the assembly line at Mays Landing, New Jersey, the bombs are secured inside the cylindrical halves of the cluster wall. The bomb is held together by 9 steel straps attached to release buckles, which are broken open by time fuses within the fin assembly. The clusters are given high and low altitude tests at Edgewood Arsenal with a B-25 loading the 500-pounders. top of the jellied gasoline bombs. The M69 saw extensive use in the March fire raids on Tokyo and Nagoya.
Here is an abbreviated attack sequence to show you how attacks were planned and conducted.
It began about 12 hours ago in the war room at Guam, with General LeMay and his staff receiving a report on tomorrow's weather in Japan.
Osaka and everything west is reported completely socked in.
How will the general solve that one? The old man considers every vital factor and makes his decision. Now it's a question of target selection. First priority in the Tokyo area is number 573. Intelligence informs the general that 573 is already three-quarters destroyed. At the moment, number 574, still untouched, would seem more important. Operations checks the tactical plan for 574. General LeMay orders the required changes, okays the target, and commits all executive details to his staff. 1,000 hours of research. Collated facts and figures have been distilled into Tactical Plan 574.
Aircraft will assemble as briefed with 3 groups of P-51s for escort. Smoke markers at 1-minute intervals will be dropped by lead planes to expedite departure from assembly point. 1 squadron each wing will carry M47 incendiary clusters. Altitude of attack, 12,000 feet. Planes of 314th Wing will carry capacity fuel loads of approximately 7,300 gallons per plane. Calibrated airspeed of 210 miles per hour will be flown by all aircraft on bombing run. Radar landfall 3450 north and 140 east will be the same for all planes to afford a good land-water contrast checkpoint. The Navy is requested to furnish the following facilities for air-sea rescue purposes. 3 surface vessels to proceed to positions X. 4 submarines assigned to lifeguard duties at positions Y. 2 Dumbos to orbit at stations Z. 4 B-29s will orbit as super Dumbos at the following positions.
Each section of the plan is double-checked. To supervise certain aspects of planning, Lieutenant Colonel Catton, a former lead crew pilot, was recently brought over to staff as project officer. Takeoff time is flashed to the controller. Here in the control room, status panels and a mission board are maintained to show at a glance the countless up-to-the-minute details of all daily operations. Prior to takeoff, each mission is set up on the board to afford a visual progress of the flight, from takeoff to target and return. Colored yarns, 1 for each wing, are laid out to indicate the flight lines, which pass close to Iwo Jima, the halfway point, and proceed as specified in the field order to the proper target. Other symbols are used to mark air-sea rescue positions. A timetable of statistics for each wing as planned and flown is recorded from hourly reports on the status panel, beginning with takeoff time.
Interestingly, a previous Army Air Corps officer had written on the vulnerability of Japan to incendiaries. In his 1937 study, Japan as an Objective for Air Attack, Captain Thomas D. White, who later became Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the 1950s, wrote, "Large sections of Japanese cities are built of flimsy and highly flammable materials. The earthquake disaster of 1924 bears witness to the fearful destruction that may be inflicted by incendiary bombs." Even Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had pointed out this vulnerability as early as 1939. Cities made of wood and paper would burn easily. The Army talks big, but if war comes and there were large-scale air raids, there is no telling what would happen. Japanese firefighting equipment was primitive and inadequate for the disaster that was about to befall. Also, the nature of targets in Japan was different than those in Germany. Japanese industry, more widely dispersed and subcontracted within Japanese cities, meshed within them, was less vulnerable to precision attack. On the night of 9 March 1945, LeMay transitioned to the second phase of the B-29 bombing campaign from the Marianas. The first 5 months of the bombing had been to hone procedures and become more effective. With those now in place, it was time for execution. The attack on Tokyo that night was dubbed Operation Meetinghouse. LeMay chose a small area of Tokyo, a 3 by 4 square mile area that housed an estimated 750,000 people. American intelligence had determined correctly that a high concentration of small factories that made up Japan's cottage industry production capability were in this specific area of Tokyo. With the target selected, the airplanes loaded, and the crews briefed, the first B-29 lifted off from Guam's North Field just after 5:30 on the afternoon of 9 March 1945. That first B-29 was followed by the remainder of the force taking off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian at 50-second intervals, all bound for Tokyo. In total, 325 Superfortresses took off to fly the 1,500 miles to Tokyo. Lead crews firebombed an X in the middle of the 10 square mile target area, and the rest of the armada followed, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries. Jellied gasoline bombs rained down on Tokyo for 3 hours, and by 3 a.m. a firestorm of immense proportions was sweeping across the city. 100,000 were consumed by fire, spontaneously combusted, died inhaling heated air, asphyxiated, or were trampled to death in the panic. Glass liquefied and was blown into the air, where it rained down and embedded in scalps like molten lava. Some people ran for the Futaba School, known for its massive swimming pool, and the next day thousands lay dead in and around it, having been boiled. The fire claimed nearly 16 square miles of the city. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey wrote it was the greatest disaster ever visited upon any city. Post-attack analysis showed Tokyo's ability to produce war material, or any material, had been cut in half. Around 90 U.S. airmen were missing after the raid, and 14 B-29s never returned, either due to enemy fire or accident. The 21st Air Force followed the Tokyo attack with raids on Japan's largest cities. Nagoya 2 days later, 2 square miles destroyed. Osaka, 8 square miles destroyed. Kobe, 3 square miles destroyed. And Nagoya again, 3 square miles destroyed. After all 5 raids were completed, the Air Force had destroyed 31.9 square miles of the 4 largest Japanese cities. In just 5 missions, the Air Force had inflicted destruction equal to 41% of the total destruction of German cities over the course of the war. And this had been accomplished with less than 1% of the total bomb tonnage dropped on Germany. During this entire 4-city campaign, 22 bombers were lost. The campaign took on a momentum of its own as cities with industrial production were selected. Later in the campaign, when the bombers were headed home, the fighter escorts were no longer needed given the virtual absence of a threat from the Japanese Air Force, and the fighters conducted strafing operations to destroy targets.
B-51s drop down for strafing runs, concentrating on definite objectives from here to the enemy coast. Skimming along at maximum speed, the fighters pair off and go to work cutting vital lines, blasting away at communications, radio installations, power lines. Swooping down on enemy transportation, railroads, marshalling yards, small suburban factories. On to shipping targets. Freighters, fishermen, trawlers, harbor and coastal craft, destroyer or lugger in it. After strafing, our fighters climb back to rally point and the waiting B-29 navigator planes. With the first sight of Iwo, fuel gauges are down close to empty, but fighter spirits begin to rise. They wind up and finish with a kick, coming past Suribachi at whiplash speed, and zoom into their victory rolls. After the last fighter groups are in, all hands sweat in those first limping B-29s. That runway is a beautiful sight as they let down with engines out, low in gas, or beat up by flak and fighters. In 3 months, nearly 2,000 crippled or gas-shy B-29s havened at Iwo. You can understand why those 4 fanboys blessed those Marines and even named their planes after them. The lucky ones are fueled and depart for home bases in an hour. But Iwo still has its hazards. Weather can turn this station into a hopeless daymare. Fog and quick overcast often blacks out the airstrip during these crucial periods. That means orders to bail out. Vanguard bomber staggers back to Iwo, only to flatten out at the last heartbreaking second. By some miracle, the whole crew got away from their stations to safety before 2,000 gallons of flaming gas enveloped them.
This is a partial list of cities bombed with the U.S. equivalent city in size at that time. I won't make a judgment on the morality of attacks, but the horror of war comes through this fact. The Japanese will to fight was not broken after this almost unfathomable, horrific, incendiary destruction of their cities. An atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on 6th August, and the Japanese continued to fight. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese emperor then decided to surrender, but a group of high-level Japanese leaders desired to sabotage his recording to the Japanese people and desired to fight on. The lesson is this: war is horrific because the only way to win is to break the enemy's will to fight, and that is very hard against a determined enemy and causes almost unimaginable pain and suffering. Robert McNamara, later U.S. Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, worked for LeMay in World War II, and in the Academy Award-winning 2003 documentary Fog of War, McNamara says, quote, "LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose and not make it immoral if you win?" Unquote. 2 final points. Operation Downfall, the U.S. invasion of Japan, was planned for around 1 November 1945. The War Department estimated in late July 1945 that this operation would cause between 1.7 to 4 million U.S. casualties and 5 to 10 million Japanese dead. Had you been a military planner at this time and suggested, I don't think we should conduct an incendiary campaign or drop atomic bombs, it's just too inhumane, you probably would have been met with a response such as, okay, so you're suggesting we stop and potentially sacrifice 1.7 to 4 million U.S. servicemen with a land invasion so we can be more humane towards the Japanese, who started the war, by the way? Is that what you're suggesting? By the end of the B-29 bombing campaign over the next several months, 66 cities with a pre-bombing population of 21 million people lay in ruins. The B-29s had also dropped mines on harbors and airfields, disrupting and destroying over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping. According to Japanese records, the aerial mining campaign accounted for 63% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses during the final half year of the war. Over 600 war production factories and thousands of small contractor operations in the cities were destroyed. About 30% of the Japanese were homeless and probably about 330,000 killed. The U.S. suffered the loss of 485 B-29s and 212 fighters, with 3,041 crew missing or killed. As you know, at this time, the atomic bomb was ready for employment, and B-29s were launched from Tinian Island and dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6 and 9 August, ending the war. While the incendiary campaign and 2 atomic bombs brought horrific destruction, they had served a purpose, ending the war and making unnecessary a land invasion, which would have cost millions of American and Japanese lives. Ironically, in 1964, the Japanese government awarded LeMay the First-Class Order of Merit of the Grand Cordon of the Rising Sun for his assistance with Japan's air defense program. I believe this is the highest award given to any foreigner. If you recall, I promised you an interesting story about the movie The Last Bomb. If you go on YouTube and see some of these old films made by the War Department and the different services, you'll see an interesting anomaly. For example, you may see that one recaps the entire war and you scratch your head, hey, that left out the Battle of Midway. Yeah, that's because it's an Army film. There was intra-service rivalry. Every service wanted to show their contribution to the war. That's understandable, I get it. So during this time of this incendiary campaign, the Navy had just made a full-color film, which the jealous air staff found not only impressive, but quite breathtaking. So to trumpet this bombing campaign, the air staff brought to the Marianas a noted filmmaker and crew to create a full-color film of the bombings. If you want to read more on today's topic, I have a few sources to recommend, not in any order. Improvised Destruction, Arnold LeMay and the Firebombing of Japan by William W. Raff is really well researched and came out in War in History Journal, October 2006. Endgame in the Pacific, Complexity, Strategy, and the B-29s is an Army CGS-C paper by Major Gerald S. Gorman, and also well researched and written. A quite fascinating read is A Cartographic Fade to Black, Mapping the Destruction of Urban Japan During World War II by David Fedman and Kerry Caracas in the Journal of Historical Geography. What makes this such a fascinating article is that Fedman was doing research in the Branner Library at Stanford University and found several old maps and materials on this bombing campaign. So he sought out a leading expert on the Japan air raids, geographer Kerry Caracas, a professor in the Department of Political Science, Economics, and Philosophy at the City University of New York. Together, they went on a research journey and made some great discoveries. Caracas maintains the bilingual website japanairraids.org. I highly recommend it. You can read the U.S. General and U.S. Ambassador Henry Byroad's interview on the President Truman Library website. It provides good insight not only on the construction of airfields in China, but on the U.S. aircraft flying the hump from India into China. Last but certainly not least is this Mark Seldon article, A Forgotten Holocaust, U.S. Bombing Strategy, the Destruction of Japanese Cities and the American Way of War from World War II to Iraq, in the Asia Pacific Journal, May 2, 2007. I particularly like this article. Thank you very much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. And please, I hope you check out some of my other videos.